right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. It's actually a bright, foggy morning here in San Francisco. Really excited about today's session. Been looking forward to this for a while now. And cool. Hey, David. Glad to have you join us from South Carolina. Please let us know where you're joining us from. All right, we got UK, Algeria. We're already hitting multiple continents, which is great. My goodness, all right, that count 5 continents already, if I don't have this mistaken, and a bunch of states as well. So this is really cool. We're here to talk about the 3 pillars of API security. It's a topic near and dear to my heart, and I'm joined by 2 absolute awesome guys, Osiris and Raj. And so really looking forward to the conversation today. Specifically, what are these pillars, right? And so we'll talk about governance. We're going to talk about testing. We're going to talk about monitoring, and maybe even a bonus 4th pillar here at the end as well. So thanks everyone for joining. We're broadcasting here from APIsec University. Also known as my kids' playroom, and so ignore all the baseball paraphernalia in the background here. Let me introduce the gang. Osiris, will start with you, VP of Open Banking Tech at US Bank, and someone I've gotten to know over the last few months. And frankly, really, Osiris, you were sort of the inspiration for this session. When we first got to chat, you talked about these different pillars that you have in your mind around API security. So maybe just give us a little bit of your background, and I'll ask you and Raj as well, and we'll get things moving here.
Cool. Cyrus Martinez. I've been focusing on API security or software services security since the start of 2018, and it's still under the cybersecurity umbrella. It's really still my passion area out of any possible option. I think it's just so dynamic and nuanced. I have implemented and run an API security practice, and under it, various programs, security testing, consulting, you name it. So still focused on API security, and looking forward to this conversation with all of you.
Right on. Yeah, I'm glad you could be here. Appreciate it. And Raj, another guy I've gotten to know over the last few months, super opinionated about cybersecurity and especially APIs. Also, really interesting background. Had some interesting stops along the way, including WeWork, and I actually had to ask him. Was the oh, there we go. I appreciate the product placement. Nice job. I asked Raj, was it I don't know, Netflix series, was that over the top? And he goes, no, it was actually not over the top enough to reflect reality. So Raj, give us some of your background.
How's it going, everyone? My name's Raj. I guess relevant background. I started out in security as a pen tester, where I actually focused on API security before it was API security. It was a lot of mobile and embedded system security, powered by the web, which had their own esoteric APIs. And the thing that I really loved doing was all the black box network pen testing. That was fun. Wrote a tool called Mallory that presented that at Black Hat a while ago, but similar concepts, how do you get at that network stream? How do you get at the layer 7 of that network stream and mess apps up? And that's what the API essentially is. Made a move in-house, worked at places like Etsy and Spotify and Squarespace, doing AppSec ProdSec, which at the time meant API first migration, microservice adoption. It's you start to learn how to secure APIs using the legacy methodologies when it was just securing a web app. And it's been fun since then. Now I'm working at ActBlue. Previously I was at WeWork and Compass, managing ProdSec, AppSec teams that we'd have to secure APIs and just everything else. So have lots of opinions about API security. And one thing I'll add is, as Dan said, Dan and I met a little bit. He was talking about some pillars that him and another friend, Osiris, were talking. I was like, hey, I have very similar pillars. I think this is very interesting. We haven't talked before, but the pillars that Osiris uses map very closely to the pillars I use. And I just think it's very interesting for us to have a conversation about these pillars and eventually kind of show where they're similar, where they're slightly different, and how our pillars in this group may be very similar, but our implementation of pillars may be slightly different. But with this model, it can help us understand, where we may have gaps in our understanding and where we can improve. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, amen to that. I see some questions from folks on the audio. I'm assuming you all can hear us. Can somebody give a thumbs up or anything like that? I can certainly hear each other. So I'm assuming. Thank you, MD, for the thumbs up. All right, great, fabulous. Little plug for APIsec University before we dive right into things. If you haven't signed up for APIsec U, highly recommend it. It's a great free course taught by a really fantastic guy, Corey Ball, who sort of literally wrote the book on hacking APIs. Talk more about it here at the end, but we're sort of doing these educational webinars under the auspices of the APIsec University kind of initiative, if you will. So that's what we're here all about. All right, so let's dive into the content here. So all right, we've got these 3 pillars, and we're going to talk about governance, we're going to talk about testing, and we're talking about monitoring. And in fact, just this week, it looks like the Gartner Group have published a report of their own. They don't call them the 3 pillars, I don't think, but I think theirs are visibility, monitoring, and posture management. Posture meaning like what's the quality of your APIs, really assessing. So very much in line. So it feels like the world is kind of coalescing around. There are these multiple aspects that really need to be addressed around API security. So, Cyrus, I'm going to start with you, right? I think you really were the first person that sort of introduced this concept of the 3. So help us with like how you landed there, and then let's dive into the governance one specifically.
Well, I guess, this evolved over time, obviously. I've got over 20 years in technical management, both app dev and cybersecurity. You just learn as you go along what works, what doesn't work, and you start putting things together, kind of like the concept of running an API security practice. The practice is the holistic API security, team or group, and then the programs are individual things like security testing, security consulting, security training, etc. So this kind of evolved. How do I kind of better structure the concept? And folks have to understand, there's a whole range from an immature organization to a mature organization, one that has maybe one security practitioner or a couple, to one that has literally hundreds. So one size does not fit all. And we have to understand that. These are just kind of general ways to better structure programs as an organization matures. So security governance is important because it's really about setting expectations and essentially say what you do and do what you say. Now, that not only provides guardrails and structure for the developers, which is the most important, but for organizational, risk, compliance, audit, for example. Again, depending on the organization and its maturity, some places have it, some don't. If you're a bank, you definitely have it. Maybe if you're a startup that's focusing on warehouse logistics, maybe you don't. So it all depends. So security governance, at least, from a regulatory perspective, I kind of break it down into, and it's not only me. I mean, this is a kind of a standard in the world. We have policies, right? And then those really shouldn't change all that often. They should be not immutable, but they should change. They should be high level, a little ambiguous to kind of give wiggle room. And then from the policies, you have your standards. And the standards are much more specific. They can change as needed over time. But they're really the specifics about what do you need to do, not so much how you need to do it, it's what do you need to do. And then you've got controls. Again, it depends on the organization whether you need these, but without them, then how would you know that you're respecting your standards, right? So the controls are there. and then best practices. And the best practices are kind of like guidance, not required, just recommended or highly recommended. And then when you put all these together, policy, standards, controls, and best practices, it helps you to kind of fill that security governance bucket. And we don't have to make it up for API security. You don't have to make this stuff up. It's out there. I mean, look at NIST, look at other experts, read documentation. Just the information that's out there is overwhelming. The challenge is finding and selecting what works for you, because every organization is different. So you've got to go out and kind of assemble it. If you want to respect the NIST framework that relates to software services security, have at it. Maybe that's your official whatever it is. But
so Cyrus, real quick, I have a quick question / comment. So one thing you said a couple of minutes ago that resonated a little bit with me was you learned this and you came up with this through your experiences, right? What worked? Like over the 20 years, what worked? And you mentioned the distinction between your program, as in like the security program, and then the things you do in your program, as in the various like tools, tactics, procedures. Oh wait, a question popped up.
Oh, sorry.
Cool. Yep, no worries. Cool. So what I think is interesting, because I know I was thinking about this myself, is for governance, when thinking about what works for your program, like how do you think about it? Like how do you know your governance pillar is working, or how do you know what part of your governance pillar wasn't working? Because like I'll share one very specific thing for me with thinking about this is when I think about working, especially with the program, there's a couple of things I'm thinking about, but one very important thing I'm thinking about is, do I, as a security practitioner, or people on my team as practitioners, have long periods of anxiety-filled days? Like, what can I do to lower our anxiety? I think, Yahoo made the whole paranoids concept, relatively popular. Paranoid doesn't necessarily mean being anxious. And I don't think any one of us living anxious lives continuously helps us. And like, I'll just point that out. Like, I know for me, when I think about all these pillars, governance being a specific one, it's like, how do I lower anxiety on the security practitioners? Like, do you have any other comments on like how you are measuring the helpfulness of your governance program?
Well, so I mean, I'm really big on, you can't be afraid to fail, right? And you learn from your mistakes, and and try and I'm huge on continuous improvement. So if something isn't working, fix it, replace it, enhance it, make it better. This goes for
what would be an example of a part of a governance program not working?
Yeah, I mean, standards are prime examples, because it's not like, oh, I'm going to write this thing out, make it law, and that's it. Everybody, usually a lot of that stuff is discussed. Ideas are exchanged with other SMEs, with people. Hey, what do you think about this? I mean, I love collaborative work. I want to work with others. Better than working alone. And it's kind of like we get these minds together, we come up with the stuff, kick them around for could be months, and do our best. That's the thing. We're just doing our best to put this stuff out there. And if over time it's demonstrated that it wasn't a good statement to put out, it wasn't a good standard, replace it or enhance it and throw it away. I mean, that to me is just so grounded.
This is why I'm so excited about this conversation, by the way, is because we didn't prep that, right? But what you just said is exactly the thing that I would also do. Like, the way I think about governance working is, and I'm just reiterating what you're saying, but I want to really highlight the point for everyone here to maybe hear it again too, is collaborate with your stakeholders on the policies. They should not be top-down mandated from security or from some book. You do that collaboration. You figure out where there's agreements. You write those down. You put them out there. If you are noticing that your policies are being agreed upon and like being referenced, if you're noticing that like the wiki page gets traffic every once in a while, if you're seeing that stuff, it's working. If you notice that after writing your policy, you revisit it yearly and no one opened it, that's bad. That makes me feel anxious. That makes me feel like wasted work, wasted effort. Like, are people reading it? That just feels horrible. And like, yeah, I 100% agree with you. Like, that is totally the signal.
Something really disturbs me about the thought of having governance statements that cannot be changed or modified for X amount of time. Let's say, they're there and you can't, we're going to have another review in a year, but you have to, it has to stay there for a year. Like, no, if you know that it's not working and people agree, get it out of there tomorrow.
Yep.
That's just, I mean, that's what agility is about, right?
Yep.
In software development.
Speaking of agility too.
Natural.
Yeah, speaking of agility, and one of these questions, guardrails answer live. I'll just hit that button for answering it live.
Yeah, go for it.
So like part of the agility is being able to implement some of these things via automation, where once, you know, the idea is agreed upon, we can let the computers do the work for us. And if we need to tweak the policy verification or tweak whatever, we go in and we can easily tweak that sort of guardrail. So like, I guess I'll just, we'll skip a little bit ahead. When I think about some of these things when it comes to guardrails, what I think is you have an API, your API is deployed via this naming structure. There's a policy that says any API that touches PII needs to be authorized to ensure that the appropriate entity accesses the data, right? Like that's a very general policy statement, probably will exist somewhere. What does that mean if you start going a little bit deeper? Okay, well, it means like when you talk to API developers, like, you know what, all of the PII relevant APIs are sourced on /user/shop, whatever. So then we can start saying, you know what, there's going to be a standard in our organization that says any API that's anchored on /user/shop must inherit the class that does the middleware that does authorization. That's the standard. Cool. That's written down. We share, we do the education. Boom. That's all good. But the guardrail now can be implemented. We can implement a guardrail in SaaS tooling or even dynamic tooling saying, hey, let's iterate programmatically against our API definition to find all those APIs that are in that anchor and highlight any that do not inherit the middleware that presumably is used to implement authorization. It's not necessarily we'll catch if it's implemented incorrectly, but at least you'll know if there's that basic implementation detail that went off the rails. So like when I think about guardrails and governance, I think like, and then also the, is it working? It's how quickly can a policy statement be turned into a static analysis rule in your system to check it. If that is a possibility, it's feeling good. I just want to throw it out there.
To me, to simplify it, when someone says, you know, what is a guardrail? What does that mean? Think about driving and, you know, side of the highway. That's literally the guardrail. It's literally there to keep you from going off of the highway into the ditch, maybe even getting killed. It's there for safety. So these guardrails are basically, what do you have to do? And believe me, I mean, my background is in computer science. I'm a former developer, and developers in general, for the basics, they want to know, just tell me what I need to do, and then leave me alone. You know, let me do my work. So it's just basically about what do you need to do to stay compliant or to stay secure. That's what the guardrails are.
And I think it's why we started this conversation with governance, right? Which is, you know, how do we set ourselves up for, you know, developing secure APIs that follow a standard that, you know, everyone, you know, adheres to the same sort of guide rails. And I appreciate you guys giving some like real specifics. I see a bunch of questions like from Lillian, do you recommend succinct sections regarding API security in an information security policy? Actually, I'd love for you guys to take a look at this one here. I'll throw it up. Or do you recommend something separate and more specific? Any thoughts here, guys?
So I'll throw something out first. So something that would be very important to consider when you answer that question is like, what's your business? So imagine companies that are doing those like the fintech companies that do all the connections between organizations, right? Like they are API companies. Like their API is their business, and their customers are generally the programmatic computers of their customers. Having very specific callouts on how one should think about API security for those organizations is not just like relevant to their business, but should potentially, one would argue, be understandable by the business leaders of their business because they are an API company. On the other side, let's say you're an e-commerce company. You do have an API because that's how people are implementing things. But your API is probably powering, your API probably is being touched by like 33% of your developers because a large portion of the front-end devs are just like, you know, doing user experience, and even the mobile app devs are probably doing lots of just UX-y client-side stuff. Like having a specific call out for API security in your policy at that level, maybe not as important, but the concepts that you would have in your information security policy that's relevant for developers, like sanitization concepts and like responsibility with third-party dependency concepts and any like that, they should be consumable by the larger developer base. And having the API specific version of that may not be very consumable. And this goes back to one of the earlier conversations we had, like, how do you know if your governance program is working? You are collaborating with your stakeholders and you're getting engagement with your stakeholders. If you are a company where a third of your org is doing API dev and 2/3 are not, you're not going to get that level of collaboration on those policies than you would if you're like a Plaid that does APIs as their business. Sure. And like that would be my recommendation there.
And regarding the question, trying to fully understand it, I am about succinctness, so that's a good word. So every statement should be as succinct as possible. That makes it easily consumable, quickly consumable, removes ambiguity, which is where you're gonna get into problems. Anything ambiguous should really be scrutinized for revision. So I would have individual bullet style, not bullet, but numbered statements that are as brief as possible, but hit the target as quickly as possible.
So let's move on from governance. Right. So we've built our governance structure. We've documented it, not too wordy. We've gotten specific. We put the guardrails in. So the next pillar that we've been talking about is testing, right? And making sure. I've got a cameo for my dog here.
Oh,
So let's talk about testing, right? And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It's where I spend a lot of my own time in this market. But here, Raj, why don't we start with you? Like, what are your thoughts around why testing, how to approach it, what you should be trying to achieve?
Yep. So for testing, when I think about testing's main customer for me is my security team, my security program. I need to test the things that I've implemented to support developers to make sure that they're functioning, they're driving the risk down to the organization. So what the nuance there is that there is going to be the type of guardrail that's at the governance side that's implemented as a static analysis test that is then surfaced in CI/CD. That's not the test that I'm talking about. The test that I'm talking about at this pillar is test, do the same static analysis stuff, do the same dynamic analysis stuff to find the types of vulnerabilities that make it out to production, the types of vulnerabilities that are found by bug bounty programs, to verify the attack surface that your API is presenting and like how are you mapping that surface is in line with your expectation on the tools. Like you write those tests so that you can find cool bugs. It's generally what you're going to do when you're pen testing, but you do it to confirm all the assumptions in your governance and guardrails. Like, okay, the last 3 weeks, the bug bounty program found these 2 authorization bugs. Why did we not find it in our guardrails? Oh, it's because it was a very esoteric pathway on a distributed API. Okay, that's fine. We get it. However, let's start noticing, oh shit, the identity and access management team, they implemented a new way of doing authorization, and that's not part of the guardrail. That testing that you get from the bug bounty program, that testing you get from dynamic API tests that you can write very specific to API will surface these sorts of things really quickly. And then you want to make sure that your security team consumes these tests so they can iterate on the guardrails quickly. That's like the slight nuance difference between the testing here, but the testing that also exists in the guardrail section, because a lot of the tools that you'll use to test your assumptions as a security team, you can use in your guardrail section. You just tune the false positiveness of the test. That's how I think about it.
Well, and I think, APIs, there's all kinds of testing tools. In fact, I see some questions here, right? There's SAS, there's DAST, there's pen testers, there's bug bounty. Yeah, exactly, right? And I do think that APIs have some unique features that make them quite difficult to test in the classic sense. I mean, sure, you can do your same old source code analysis, but what we're finding is the nature of breaches that happen with APIs don't typically look like what we see with a web app or they're injection attacks. Typically, they're not cross-site scripting. People are finding logic flaws, right? The beauty of APIs is it exposes all this back-end functionality, warts and all, right?
Yeah.
And so if there's flaws in that back-end code, that's also getting exposed. And to test an API doesn't mean poking around a web app and fuzzing form fields and things like that. It's writing code, right? You literally have to write code to exercise an API, and that's a whole other skill set.
That's the game changer. So, legacy is software applications that expose a UI, if they expose a UI, right? And the categorization for that is human to system interface, the UI, right? The game changer is APIs. That's a system to system interface. Now you don't have the kind of the constraints of a human. I mean, humans are not machines. You literally have machines working against machines. They can be automated. They can work 24/7. They can have massive compute, massive storage. They could be driven by artificial intelligence. They can learn. That is the game changer. And as you know, in cybersecurity, it's all about the attacker just needs to be right once. The defender has to be right every time. That is a daunting challenge. So security testing, I mean, just like testing for quality or functional testing, it's got to be there. How are you going to create something, release it to the world, and not ensure that it's as bulletproof or secure as possible? And it happens. That's why you've got breaches and vulnerabilities out there, because it either wasn't tested, it was poorly tested, or it wasn't tested enough, and maybe it was tested enough, and you're still going to get burned because you can't find everything. It's
something I wanted to highlight.
Effective.
You said something interesting, like poorly tested. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, software, it was created by a human. It's going to have flaws, and there are defects, bugs, and there are defects design. And defect bugs are the easier ones to find. Defect design are the tougher ones to find because, that's what we intended on implementing, and that's what we did. Great, your implementation is vulnerable by design, and you're going to get pawned sometime in the future. So security testing is a big deal, and it is nuanced. I mean, you can do, I know we talk about pen testing, but I also label pen testing as something different. Manual security testing. It's a human performing the security testing. Now, when you get into stuff like SAS or static analysis security testing or DAS, dynamic analysis security testing, or even IaaS interactive application security testing, what you want to do is use tools, whether they're open source or commercial. And I always say, use as much as you can afford and as much as you can implement to cover the need and fill the gaps in with humans. What you can't do, what you couldn't do, what you couldn't, and not the other way around. Don't use a lot of humans and add a little bit of software automation. Do it the other way around. So having all of this and aligning to, say, a standard like the OWASP Top 10 for APIs, that's where you start. It's not the end. It's your foundation. The reason the OWASP Top 10 for APIs are there is because a lot of minds came together and they have over years and said, look, these are the top 10 vulnerability types that we see in the world. Those are the ones you need to focus on first. But even if you can knock all of those out, you can't stop there because you're going to get burned on 11, 12, 13, 15, 20, whatever the others are. So security testing is a big deal. Automation is a big deal. Integration into CI/CD pipelines is a big deal. So security testing is your second pillar.
So I don't know, Raj, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, the one thing that was come to mind a little bit is like, how do you know? Well, you said you're not potentially you're not testing good enough. You're not testing well. You're not testing enough, right? Like those two are they're very interesting statements to me. And like the reason they're interesting to me is like, what's the purpose? I think, or rather, more specifically, to know if it's good or enough, we need to understand like what's the purpose of testing. Like I think that's actually an interesting thing we haven't brought up just yet. And I think we're all three of us are making assumptions, and everyone on this call is probably making assumptions on what their purpose of testing is. Is the purpose of testing finding vulnerabilities? Is the purpose of testing like checking the effectiveness of something? Is the purpose of testing to do some whiz bang to get some budget, right? Like, I bet you on this call, at least one person said yes to one of those, either one of those three, right? Like, so presumably for the testing pillar, being very clear on your purpose of testing and why that purpose supports your overall strategy for your program. That's something I think that is something that, you know, we should think about that way. And then the last thing I'll say related to that is, I very, very much believe on this pillar, the purpose of testing for me is to verify the guardrails are sufficient for the threat actors and TTPs I'm concerned about, and verify the guardrails that are deployed are working still. That's the testing purpose. And if that is the purpose, then I know how much to invest in like pen testing, and I know how to scope out the pen test. I know how much to invest in my bug bounty program, where to like focus people. I know how much and what sort of DAS tooling I need, because I need a DAS tool that can exercise my business logic to the point to detect that my authorization guardrail is correct, my output encoding guardrail is correct, right? And like, that's how I know if I'm good enough. And then if I have to improve my guardrail testing, then I need different tools. Like if I say, oh, I have this new guardrail that's really important to me. Like the guardrail specifically is like, our OFAC stuff is implemented correctly. That's the guardrail. And now I need to like, shit, how do I test that? Well, I guess I need another tool because I have no tool to be able to test that for me, right? And that's something I think is important to highlight for testing.
I've got
throw something in here, Raj, which is you're talking about having the guardrails, right? So you may have missing guardrails, right? Maybe incomplete. And to Cyrus's point, where automation and sort of comprehensive testing comes into play, right? And comprehensive is difficult when we're talking about APIs, especially, right? You think about the footprint that we've got, and why are we seeing breaches coming in through APIs? It's because there's just so much surface. You think about an app with 50, 100 different endpoints, right? Any one of them could be attacked from 10, 20 different angles. And now you're talking about a remarkable amount of test coverage. So there is a need for automation here, right? Which isn't to say anything's going to cover you magically for every scenario, but if you're relying on a manual pen test that's happening once or twice a year, you're going a long period of time with pushing code live, because we know you're going to keep releasing code before that next pen test comes. And even when it does come, if you're relying on manual, you're probably not getting the coverage that you need.
So let's go back to the essential question. What is the purpose or value of security testing? And the same three words that I use to describe every cybersecurity professional's main goal or main mission applies to why security test. And the three words are minimize security risk. It's all about that. Every cybersecurity professional's job, it's not about I'm a network security engineer, I'm an application security professional. No, your job is to minimize security risk. Security testing is all about minimizing security risk, detecting issues, and like you said, it's not comprehensive. You do the best that you can with what you can afford and what you can implement. Because if you can afford 3 different SaaS tools, why not? Why don't you put them in there? People, personnel, technology, and money, right? But not everybody can. So you do what you can, you implement what you can use, what you can afford, and do your best. And basically, if you do your best, you at least should be.
This may be a good segue to the third pillar here, right? And actually, Jamie's asked the question: how do you know if you're implementing the right implementation, right? And so it's really, how do you know, right? It's a tough question. And so maybe this brings us to the monitoring side, right? So we've built our governance, we've got standards and well-documented approaches to creating our APIs. We're testing them, as much as we can with automation. It's continuous. But let's talk about runtime, right? Like we're now into production. So, Raj, you were talking about how do you make sure that your guidelines are your was it
Guardrails.
Guardrails, thank you, are working, right? And maybe that's, to Jamie's question, how do you make sure like you've got actually a sound, secure program in place?
Yeah. So there's a couple of implementations we've actually talked about today. One implementation we talked about was our developers implementing some business requirement in the API. That's an implementation. There's an implementation of our security engineers have implemented a guardrail in the developer's workflow to make it less likely for vulnerable things to go out there. That's an implementation. There's another implementation that our security team does where it's how do we verify that our guardrails are working. That's an implementation. And presumably there's one we haven't even got to just yet, which is how do we make sure that we're monitoring the whole thing from threat actors and like being able to quickly deal with potential breach scenarios. That's another implementation. So there's many implementations here that we need to think about verifying the correctness of. So I just want to first start there. So now we start there. Let's do the first implementation. How can we responsibly verify that a developer implements something to spec to design? More specifically, if you look at like the governance thing, we want documentation and we want to set expectations. If there is a security requirement that is brought up during a security review that's very important to us and it's very important to us, it's on us as a security team to have either a process in place or some tech in place to verify that implementation, or more specifically, verify that that requirement was implemented in a timely manner before things go into production. And everyone's organization will be slightly different here. There's some organizations that will have security gates where things are in staging and security team has to go check some box because like regulatory reasons, right? There's some organizations where that is definitely never going to be the case. There is going to be a couple of PRs flying every once in a while. Things will get out to production and like that's just out there. So our security team needs to figure out, okay, let's go to the example of that again. It's like you have customer PII, APIs need to be authorized. If you know there's a feature happening because you did a security review and you said, okay, for this new feature where you're about to update people's names to support maiden names and original names, make sure that new API is using our authorization stack. Cool, that requirement's written down. It's tracked somewhere, however you want to track the requirements. And I'm going in the weeds here. Arguably, you can put that somewhere in Jira and then you can be like, all right, 3 weeks from now, alert your security team to go figure out if that thing was implemented. How do you figure that out? Well, maybe you go look at the code and you find it. Or maybe you have your static analysis tooling set up in such a way where when you wrote that security requirement, you also wrote a test in code that's failing until that thing is implemented. And then you can just use your vulnerability management process for that. So the idea here is the concept here is implementation verification requires you to generally have a couple of things. Setting expectations with the people that are implementing, keeping track of what that expectation was, and reminding yourself either programmatically or through process to go verify the implementation. If it's programmatic, it's probably going to be continuous. If it's process, it's probably going to be async. But that's the general idea. And this applies for developers implementing features, security engineers implementing guardrails, security engineers implementing tests on guardrails. That's my thoughts on that.
Cyrus, were you about to jump in?
Yeah, a lot. So what is security monitoring and protection for me? Number one, maintaining a full API catalog is a big deal. You can't manage what you don't know about, right? So you've got to, number one, know about the APIs that you've got out there in production. You've got to understand, what are they about, who their owners are, what is the highest classification of data that they handle. Is it something that's very kind of benign that the entire world can examine, or something that's in the PCI realm or PII, right? So the API catalog is a big deal for a foundation. But security monitoring and protection is essentially operational, whereas a lot of the security testing is pre-prod. I'm not saying all of it, but we know that organizations are very reluctant to permitting pen testers to do their thing in production. They're afraid. So security testing, a lot of it is a pre-prod activity. Not all of it, a lot of it. Security monitoring and protection, though, when your API is out there and it's moving data around and it's giving you access to operations, if you do not have monitoring in place, you are absolutely blind to whatever is happening out there. A lot of organizations rely on logs. Oh, we have logs, we'll review the logs, we'll do SEM, we'll review the logs and we'll find, whatever, like good luck. The logs do give you stuff, but the honest truth is that logs are used a lot in forensics for what happened, to examine, to investigate, versus what's happening now, or what has happened over the last month or 3 months when this API was compromised and you had absolutely no clue that you had unauthorized actors transacting in parallel with your authorized actors.
Well,
So,
it's interesting, Cyrus. You're bringing me back to my very first job. I was an engineer at General Motors, mechanical, and we had these signs all over the factory and the engineering plants and so forth that were like all about how the cost of remediation escalates by an order of magnitude the further along that vulnerability, that flaw gets. Solving it in design phase, that's 1, right? Solving it in test phase, that's 10. Solving it in production, that's 100, right? And so, there's obviously a need for monitoring and alerting, but when I look at these breaches that take place, right? Can you actually detect them in runtime, right? Like, yes, if you're looking for high volume attacks, for sure, right? Your WAF should be able to handle that, right? If you're looking for injections, that should be able to be detected and remediated in runtime. You should be detecting that, frankly, before it ever got to production in the first place, right? Those types of flaws, pretty easy to find. Those business logic issues, which I think we're coming back to, is like, that's where the big breaches take place, right? At Postal Service and elsewhere. And those are kind of like your own personal 0 days, right? These are, application logic, like big Coinbase, right? A person was able to modify a product ID and sell Bitcoin that he did not own, right? I don't know of any SAST or WAF, source code analyzer, anything like that that's going to find those, right?
Cool story time. Just
right,
really random. This is something I'm relatively proud about. At some point in the maturity of your program, maybe you do implement the hard technology to detect runtime business logic bugs. But it is hard. It's for sure hard. But maybe at some point you can get there. For example, I luckily was able to have an opportunity to do something like this that at e-commerce company I worked at. Essentially, what was in place was we had an API deployed where there was a very well-defined way that developers should look up if a thing was authorized. If a thing was authorized or not, or more specifically, there's a very well-defined way to understand the actor, and then when that actor is checked for authorization. So you could figure out in the back end, okay, I can actually generically look at like a call graph of the API and say, okay, if I'm accessing this part of the database, most likely you should have verified that this either user, like a buyer or a seller, relates this, meaning I can see, did a lookup on this part of this API, was it recently preceded by a lookup for a user? And
sure.
You could, I was lucky that I was able to implement that. And I implemented that and we threw it out there. Like 4 years goes by. I've long gone from this organization and I like put this alert in there. I was sure this should never happen, but if it does, it's an authorization bug, call Raj. Because I just never thought it was going to happen. Like 4 years later, one of my friends who still worked at the organization was like, hey, Raj, this thing triggered and it said we should talk to you. It was like, oh shit, it actually worked. And it 100% found a problem where someone deployed an API, it accessed data that should have been authorized. They didn't do the authorization flow, and it highlighted that a person, and specifically wasn't even an actor, it was just a misuse of the API. It's like, we pulled the data that should have been authorized. And like, you could do that stuff. So although it is difficult, it's not necessarily the first thing you solve for, but you can be thinking about that idea. Like if your specific API, your specific business has like a couple of possible O-days that are game changers, just game ending O-days, then you can think about architecting your APIs, architecting your traces through the APIs, thinking about state machines that are like known bad states and like detecting against them. Like those are for sure things. Also, you can think about like writing automated tests to always look for these possible bad things, right? And like setting up situations where it would like highlight failures that would be poked by pen testers and like just do them. And like you can do that. You just have to decide it's time to do that.
I'm going to be mindful of time here. I feel like we could do a whole session on each one of these, and maybe we will if you guys are game. But let's wrap up this. I teased that there might be a bonus section, and Raj, you're big on this sort of rinse and repeat and iterate. Help us understand what you're talking about here.
So the general idea here, and this goes back to something I said right at the beginning, don't be afraid to throw things out, but also that means don't be afraid to just solve a very small problem right at the beginning. Like don't try, I think right at the beginning, to implement 100% of the policies that you think are important for an organization that's about 3 times your size, and then have your SAST and your DAST being deployed at the same time, and then do your rate limiting and your blocking all at the same time. It's okay to just do one at a time. Do it well, understand what well is for you, deploy it, and iterate. And like, I think it sounds like, yeah, obviously, Raj, like that's what we do. But it's important to tell yourself this, I think. Like it's important to tell yourself almost every day or whenever you do your sprint planning, it's like, what are we only going to focus on today? What are we okay not focusing on, knowing we're not focusing on it, and then going and iterating next time? Oh, Cyrus just left. So that's the idea of iterating. And like, I think it's important to say it to yourself regularly, which means what are you measuring? What are you focusing on? How long you're going to iterate? Do it again.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Cyrus, I don't know if we're losing you here. Are you there? Yeah, we can see you.
Yeah.
All right. Technology, yeah, indeed. Let me sort of wind things down here. So we had a lot of questions around getting into specifics, right? So I think this is we're just beginning a topic here, frankly. So we're planning to run these kinds of these webinars probably every month. The very next one that we want to do is on automotive API security. We've already got some fantastic speakers lined up. If anyone on this call has automotive expertise and would like to be part of it, I'd love for you to reach out and let me know. But wanted to just kind of share again and invite everyone that's on the call to visit APIsec University. Pretty easy to find. You can just Google it. And as I mentioned, this is totally free. It's a non-vendor course. There's no product pitches whatsoever in these courses. Developed by a good friend Corey Ball, the author of Hacking APIs. And it's very, very good. It's hands-on. You're really going to learn how to test and find flaws in your APIs. You'll see, how to set up your lab, how to do recon, testing API, scanning the endpoints, and all of the things that we've been talking about, frankly, here today. I do want to invite folks to try out a tool that we've made available. It's also free. It's called EthicalCheck. You literally can just put a pointer to your specification file, add your email address, and run a live scan on your API right now. It's going to do things like look for broken authentication, rate limiting. We have a more advanced version that goes through the entire OWASP top 10. So really invite everyone here on the call to try out EthicalCheck. As I said, it's free. And it will, identify some holes or vulnerabilities that you might have in your own APIs. Sign up for APIsec University if you're looking to really beef up your own expertise and skills. So I'll leave it there in terms of the plugs here. So let me just go back through some of the questions here. Where can we learn how to securely create an API? Well, certainly on APIsec you can learn how to test your API. Guys, do you have any pointers to, where to learn kind of strong API security development practices? Sounds like a course we should add.
I would say I haven't looked at it recently, but reviewing OWASP top 10 APIs, and like something that I would recommend, presumably as a developer, is go to the OWASP top 10, not just the API, but the web and mobile, and like read their 10s, the 3 top 10s for the recent time. The general idea is they're just going to show you vulnerabilities that are very relevant today. And I'm a strong believer. Yeah, they're very common. And like, I'm a believer in, if you're building software and you're relatively familiar with the type of vulnerability, you understand how you could mistakenly do them, that will be the first step for people who build APIs to like build them more safely. Because at some point, I haven't looked at it recently, but presumably there's like direct object reference and API, OWASP top 10 API. If people understand that concept, it's like, oh shit, this API call is using a unique UID versus, or atomically increasing number versus a specific 1, 2, 3. It's like, oh, that's a direct object. Like, that's bad. Like, being familiar with the vulnerabilities will help you build safely. That's probably the quickest thing you can do.
Agreed. Yep.
Let me check a few other ones. We've already answered some of these. That was a question about the course. I was completing API security architect training. Blah, blah, blah. How I obtain course completion certificate. Yes, there are course certificates. You can earn CPEs on APIsec University as well. Here's one from Chris from earlier. What specific NIST standards would you recommend with respect to API security? Any that you're familiar with, guys?
I can't remember the exact numerical reference.
Oh, you're thinking about like 800, whatever, 13.
Yeah, like 800 A, B, C. There's 3 that have come out that are associated with the governance and the securing of APIs. I don't know, Dan, if we haven't. I'm happy to get the exact information and links.
Let me know
afterward.
And we'll do a follow up for everyone who's on the call and
sounds great.
That couldn't join. One little story, maybe as we wrap up here. One that I actually like to pay attention to is FedRAMP. Now, FedRAMP is specifically for cloud services to the government. So if you don't sell the government, you don't really need it. But it's actually a very detailed and prescriptive standard. And so you'll see a lot of banks use it, healthcare, because it doesn't just say thou shalt secure your APIs. It says you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, right? They have a new version coming out, Rev 5. It's actually due in November. And what's sort of interesting is in Rev 4, they had a monthly web interface vulnerability scan requirement. All right, you had to test your web interfaces monthly. And I personally, talked to a lot of FedRAMP certified folks, and I said, okay, web interface, are you testing your APIs? And the response was, well, that's not required. And it's funny, right? APIs are sort of not considered an interface, right? I got your web interface, your mobile, that's what I need to test, right? And you look at Coinbase and many others, that's not where the breach happens. It's people are reverse engineering those API calls that are going back and forth between your interface and the back end, and that's where people are manipulating. So in the draft version, and I imagine it'll be in the final version of this Rev 5, it now says monthly scanning of your web interfaces, including APIs. Right?
Oh, nice.
Like that was a gap, right? And are addressing it. So
see, the government works. We can figure it out.
It's actually a very well run program.
Just
I give FedRAMP a lot of credit. But it's funny, like, the sense out there was, I got to test my interfaces. That means a UI interface, not a programming interface. And as you can see, like, hackers have learned that's where the low-hanging fruit really exists. So, guys, really appreciate you both being part of this conversation. I really appreciate all the questions and comments from everyone online. We're going to do these regularly. If you've got ideas for topics we should cover, hit me up. I'm just Dan at APIsec.ai. And we'll send out the the recording here shortly. And thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate it. Raj, Osiris, you guys are awesome. And we'll talk again soon. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.